Broadcast?
Should be live.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. The date is March 17th. The time is 6:03. This is a meeting of the Planning Board Subcommittee to discuss our landscaping regulations. Here tonight with me is Jamie Rabbit, Director of Planning, Susan Axelrod, Caper Wilson, and Liz and from the planning board, and Randy Collins, who's a landscape architect who has kindly volunteered to help us with our discussion on our landscaping regulations. So Randy, perhaps you want to just start off and tell everyone a little bit about yourself, and we'll go from there.
Sure. I've been a landscape architect since 93 or 2 or something like that. Went to URI. It was in the early stages of the program that they have for landscape architecture. Worked for a number of different landscape architectural firms. The first one was sort of a mom and pop high-end residential firm that did work in Watch Hill and Newport and other areas. And then I worked at Gates Layton and Associates for 18 years, and I've been working with Beta Group now for, I don't know, since 2009. I have done this kind of work before. I helped the Department of Transportation rewrite their landscape specifications that they have in their blue book, so-called, and updated the standard details for landscape installation for the same effort. I live in town. I grew up in Charlestown. I lived in town for 26 years or something like that. I forget. So that's a little about me.
Great, thank you. And I know that Randy had suggested that we kind of start off our general conversation with what things we find that are not adequate, or things that are do not seem to be fulfilled via regulations, what our frustrations are, what's positive. It's been quite a long time since the landscaping regulations have been rewritten. It's been many, many years. You can see by the, which you should have gotten from Lynn, where landscaping fits into our ordinances, and there are some drawings. You can tell just by the drawings how out of date they are. So who would like to start? Thoughts? So that Randy can get an idea of what we're looking to do.
Well, I have one more question.
Sure.
So we've recently been looking at the Old Tower Hill Road neighborhood plan. So I looked at the draft landscaping standards that they're proposing in their exhibit. Mm-hmm. And I think we also ought to consider how that fits in with what our concerns are. Mm-hmm. Because the whole first start is, the following standards shall apply in addition to any applicable standards in the South Kingston Municipal Code, which are not modified below. And as I read the subsection A1, that would modify it, and then there's a supplemental standards below. But I think if we're going to be talking about approving a plan going forward, we should be thinking about that as we think about how we want to modify the standards, because I think we want a kind of cohesive sense across. I know the town's very different, so we can't have, I'm not considering a uniform model, but I think there should be a certain design cohesion as we think about it. So I just wanted to throw that out as something to bear in mind.
Maria, I have a
Yeah.
question, and that is, what is our ultimate goal of this meeting?
Our
of this
ultimate goal is to get the conversation going with regard to how we can improve our regulations with regard to landscaping, how they can better serve our purposes as we review the the whole gamut of projects, from smaller subdivisions to large.
With the goal of modifying the
Yeah,
regulations ultimately?
creating, yeah, a better outcome, more flexibility in some cases. And that's why we have not only the ordinances that are they're kind of all over the place, which also makes it difficult, because you would like to make it easier for people who are doing the design on a project to find your regulations, to have a similar kind of outcome that we envision, and things like waivers. How can we encourage some projects so that they don't just say, well, we want waivers from everything, instead saying, well, we can do this, we can be creative, and so on. We also have a list of things that Lynn sent out as far as also discussion points that hopefully everyone read, and even if you don't have the regs memorized, you can see through this list of conversation topics how we might kind of advance the discussion. Susan?
Well, there are two things that are especially, I think, critical for me with this, what we have right now. And one of them is the 1995 tree list of the desirable trees and shrubs. That's so very outdated. And I don't know if you guys remember, the Conservation Commission sent us a letter back in maybe late summer with a recommendation of a link to a updatable database through University of Rhode Island, where people can scan and search for specific plants. All the invasives have been removed, but it also gives more updated information about height and sun requirements and drainage and all that stuff. And it's such a better resource to direct developers to than a 30-year-old book. And so I think changing our recommendation for where people get their data is, I think, a really easy thing that we can do.
Mm-hmm.
And the Conservation Commission had also suggested a sentence about that there were also other plants that are invasive that are not permitted. So instead of saying that we really wish you wouldn't plant that invasive plant, we could be more rigid about simply not permitting certain invasive plants to go into designs. And I think that's an easy fix for that situation.
Sure.
And so that Conservation Commission letter that they sent to us was, I think it was spot on. And
Mm-hmm.
I can't find it anywhere on our online stuff, but I did print it out, so I have it with me.
What's the date of that?
Well, so I don't know. So they decided to send it to us at their August 6th meeting.
We can get that to you.
Like, I went through
Okay.
all of our minutes and all of our agendas, and I can't find when we got it, but I do have a printout of it.
Okay.
But it's really, really good.
August 6th, what year, do you know?
Oh, this past August.
Okay.
And the second thing that has been always a problem for me is what is a buffer? And buffers just, they are not created equally. And to say that we need to leave the existing buffer in place, and then all it is bullbriar and bittersweet, and that's the buffer that and I realize that a developer will call it, well, that's the natural landscape on that road. Can we do better? Then whatever the existing buffer is, just set the houses back 25 feet and we'll call it a day. Can we make our buffer better designed, better defined, with some requirements that it can't just be a bramble of bullbriar and bittersweet? That. Secondly, right now we're having a number of varieties of trees that are in decline, and if we can recognize that that buffer is full of failing, oaks from the gypsy moth infestation or something else, and we know that it's going to be gone in 10 years, do we have any power to effect change if we can foresee that that buffer is not going to be a buffer in some future time? I don't know if that's within our rights, but all buffers aren't created the same. So those are the two areas that
Okay.
I'm most concerned about right now.
Okay. I share your concern with buffers, and I know that in the regulations we have different definitions of buffers, some of which really aren't buffers, based on the either criteria as far as the width of the buffer and kind of partial buffer. There are times where you need a substantive buffer that really makes a difference when you have large scale projects or something that's adjacent to a different kind of use. But we need to have more tools as far as buffers are concerned, and more guidance when appropriate to applicants, for sure.
If I may just,
Sure.
along the same lines, what strikes me is that as you think about how the town's developing, we're becoming more intense in our density. And I think that creates different demands on our buffers. And when I look at the current landscaping regulations, they seem very focused on differences in use. And I don't think it's just differences in use. I think it's differences in densities. People, when we listen to the public hearings, people are concerned about lines of sight and other things. So, and I think that I think our landscape regulations, I'm new to this, so, but it strikes me that we've had different lenses on how we read them, depending on whether it's industrial or commercial or residential. But the way society is developing, we're going much more towards mixed use. And we need something that creates an environment. When we're looking at all sorts of design changes that create sort of clusters of environments. And we want to make sure that the landscaping fits those clusters as well. So I think we need to think about not just the changes to our existing regulations, but what are the plans that we have set in motion, and what are the needs that those are creating as well, if that makes sense.
The other thing too, and I don't know how you integrate that into regulations, but it seems as though, other than when we specifically call it out, for example, in the FDRP, sometimes the landscaping is considered at the 11th hour rather than integrated at the onset in the plan. So I don't know if that's something that we can somehow require, encourage, formulate in some manner.
Maria, can I just raise
Sure,
2 points?
Absolutely.
It's mentioned in the regs, but I think we could be more specific, and that is construction sequencing. It's so critical. I mean, the best planting in the world isn't going to survive construction. So I think we should take a close look at that. The other one, which I'm not clear on, is the whole maintenance and warranty. In one place, it's 1 year. In another place, it was 2 years. What happens if things do not withstand? Who's in charge of reviewing that? And then you're in charge. And then what happens if plants are just not being maintained or surviving?
And we have had this conversation with applicants, you know, when they're dealing with the issue of a bond, and you have trees that are dying a slow, lingering death at 1.5 years, and the requirement is 1 year, but I believe it's 2 years on street trees. So we used to actually be a little bit more stringent as far as a 2-year requirement. So definitely
not clear.
worthy of conversation.
And one other thing, it's
Yep.
on a slightly different track.
Mhm.
We don't, or at least I didn't see, a mention of invasive species. And I know this is something that's come up in the planning board, and it's always like, well, I can't do anything about it. It's an invasive species. I can take it away, and then it's going to grow back. Somehow that's not good enough. I mean, I'm not a landscape architect, and I don't know if there is something more that can be required, but I think we need to look at that.
That's great. Yeah, and we have recently alluded to the URI, Cooperative Extension, Invasives Plant Manager information, and having something like that perhaps would be helpful as well, so that it isn't just instantly written off. Oh, well, there's knotweed on the
Sorry,
property.
can't do anything.
But following what Liz just said, we've also had projects here in town where they deliberately remove the landscaping that has been prescribed at some point, where you drive by and realize that all the trees have been chopped down. I don't know what the town's power is in mandating that it be replaced. I don't know if we have any role in that. Certainly, if they come back before us, we should be able to make them replace the landscaping before they can be heard for a change to their property. But we had one a couple of years ago where they were granted permission to make drastic changes, and they never put the landscaping back that they had removed. Like, we didn't seem to have, I don't know that that's landscaping, I'm off on a different tangent, but that was very frustrating.
Well,
They had chopped all the trees down, there seemed to be nothing that we could do, and we had to approve their next changes to their property.
I don't know, but my guess is there's a huge enforcement issue. I mean, there's a cost associated with that, and there's an authorization associated with that too. So, to some extent, you know, as we think about changing regulations, we also have to think about what are the other laws and regulations that are impacted by the decisions we're making, because enforcement is one of the biggest problems we have, I think.
Yeah, but if there's no teeth in our determinations,
What are we enforcing?
Exactly.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
but unless you have an enforcement mechanism,
Yeah.
there's also no teeth.
And then the other thing, kind of related to what Liz was talking about, is the actual installation and how things are communicated with the person doing the installation and the landscape architect who did the design, issues related to soil compaction, proper planting. We often see on the plans kind of a generic, the tree with the little, support, and yeah. And I know that one project a few years ago on Ministerial Road, because it's a scenic roadway, not only was the Department of Transportation, landscape architects, they were involved, but we actually had the landscape architect on site during the installation because the buffer was so crucial in that particular case.
do you know what power we have to, I'm sure we have a dream list of things that we would like to see, but where does our power, how much can we ask of development? Like, do we need to be reined in with our list of what we'd like to see?
So, and Randy, I've worked on both sides. Randy's working on both sides, both municipal and the private sector. I think in anything you do from a code writing standpoint, you have to be reasonable, and there has to be a rational nexus to an achievable goal. So you can write a landscape code so stringent that you price 75% of projects out of the marketplace, because you take a shopping center. You may take someone who has a $250,000 budget for landscaping, and your code makes it 1.25 million. That may be cost prohibited today. It may not be cost prohibited 5 years from now. So it's really articulating the vision you are trying to achieve, and then finding a reasonable, responsible way to get there without having an objective of writing a code so strict you're going to stymie development. And I've worked for towns who have basically said, I want a reg so strict that nothing happens for the next 10 years, and we'll wait for year 11. Because their vision was something that the present economy couldn't afford, but they weren't willing to sacrifice their vision. And these were kind of redevelopment corridors. So something you brought up earlier, Susan, you can't deny someone access to a permitting process for existing noncompliance. So enforcement on a site, you cannot withhold the ability to apply on a site that may even have zoning violations. Kind of two paths. That site has a violation. It doesn't prohibit them from applying to do something different, even though they have a non-compliant site. Say Burger King.
Okay, so,
But there's no
okay,
leverage.
but wait. So I think what you're saying is, if something's currently in non-compliance,
Correct.
you can't mandate that they come into
Fix it
compliance.
before they apply.
However, if they're looking for a variance or they're looking to change the use, you can set constraints about that.
You can hold them to your existing code.
Yeah, okay. Okay,
But
and if they're looking for variances, you can condition the variances upon other things. But I think one of the primary points that I heard is what you need to be careful not to do is to mandate requirements that are so strict that they're not going to be easy for the developer to comply with as they go through. Because when you're talking about putting in a whole different change of use, there's a lot of risk involved there. And they can't guarantee the outcome at the end of the day. So you have to be mindful for what is doable and what is enforceable. Because there's no point in putting out your hope at a high level if you don't have any ability to enforce it. Because then people will go ahead and they'll do initial plantings, shall we say, but they won't keep them up.
Right.
And you also can't over-constrain your town. You've only got so many resources. And, everything is a balancing game. So you have to think about what do you think. I think of regulations as being almost the minimum requirement. And then you can encourage other things through incentives or through suggestions, but you have to think about what you can enforce because you have to think about what is doable for your community.
And that's very optimistic because I sometimes look at this in a cynical way as being the maximum requirements before we start passing out waivers. So you're saying that this is the minimum requirement and we can aspire for more. I feel like this is the maximum we can ask for until they start asking for waivers.
Yeah.
If you look at the language, though, it does give opportunity. I mean, there is language in here that says at a minimum, and the planning board can.
And the planning board can give incentives to reach for more.
And part of it, kind of leaving the discussion of stringency, I think there needs to be some illustrative effort or educational effort to this because some of the 1 tree and 3 low, growing shrubs or grass or whatever, and it doesn't allow for a lot of flexibility, or they'll just, put in ground cover instead of something more substantive. So there needs to be more in there. And then as far as flexibility, for example, we've seen projects like infill on High Street. They can't meet any of this, so they just ask for a blanket waiver. If we create some degree of flexibility in those types of infill projects, then there will actually be some green space, which not only benefits the people who live there, helps with stormwater infiltration. I think we have to remember that landscaping isn't 100% aesthetic. It often has kind of multiple values. So,
That's a really good
To just sort of carry forward on that idea a little bit, historically, regulations are kind of setting a minimum, but there's no reason that you can't invite people to do more and illustrate for them what might be possible. And one of the things that I like about
No,
doesn't
it's-
work.
Comes down to
I don't
money.
know about that.
Well, wait. It hasn't worked because all of our regulations have been mandatory and they've been dictatorial. But form-based coding is a whole different concept here. So maybe we could give it a try. I mean, it's just, if it doesn't work, it's just extra words.
Form-based code, just so everybody understand, form-based code gives you the incentives for the density. It doesn't
Yeah,
incentivize other types of improvement. Like if you do a standard light post, I'll give you 50% lot coverage. If you do a really nice light pole, I'll give you 60% lot coverage. That's not the way form-based code works. But
No, that's
something you
not the
said,
way it
Kate,
has
or
worked.
something I've worked with form-based code probably more than any planner
Yep.
in Rhode Island and most in Connecticut. So I have tons of experience with form-based code. And one thing the developers want to know, and correct me if I'm wrong, what do I need to do to get my permits? And I want it articulated. They don't want to sit at the table negotiating over 6 months on what they have to read. They don't want to read your mind. So
Yep,
what
they
I would
want the
say is
minimums.
you have to, there's a vision.
So yeah, I think that
Yeah.
you just said the important word. I wouldn't look at the guidelines as the minimum standards. I think you should be taking a different approach, which is what is the vision for what you want to see development look like in the town? It's going to vary for the different uses in the different areas, no doubt about it, but it's all going to be around a vision. And so you quickly get away from the idea that you're asking for the minimum when you are focusing on a vision, and that your regulations are
Articulate the vision.
basically articulate and give the roadmap for how that vision gets implemented.
Oh, I don't disagree with you, but I'm sorry, I'm a defense attorney, so I can't really get away from this.
We don't hold it against you.
But the bottom line is that developers, people who are focused on the bottom line, are going to read it as what is mandated. So I think it's very good to articulate all sorts of aspirational issues. I think it's all important to put into your regulations those things that you want to become the subjects of conversation. But they're going to be read not necessarily by the property owners or the people who are already invested in the town, but by developers, certainly the attorneys, and also I think most of the people who are in charge of complying with the regulations. They're going to look at the bottom line of what do they have to do.
Right,
So you
but,
need-
Right.
that's
But you need to address all of those components or you won't get more.
I'll try and give you a prime
And wait a second.
Yeah.
And also, if you can then follow up with how do we then translate the vision into the regulations?
So we'll just take a simple parking lot, right? I'm working in Town A, and their parking lot says for every parking space, I need 50 square feet of landscaping. That's the Lane Kendig model, performance zoning, which Randy's probably familiar with. And that's basically our code is a hybrid of that Lane Kendig performance zoning. It puts a square footage value on it. But if your vision is in a parking lot at every end of every parking row to have an island with 2 street trees in it, you can't just say 50 square feet because the developer is going to draw it and put 50 square feet and they're going to put it where they want. And I've seen plans where they take 4,000 square feet, there isn't a tree in a 3-acre parking lot, but there's one little area that looks like it's gorgeous. It looks like a botanical garden, but the other 3 acres doesn't have anything in it. And then they ask for a waiver from that. But if you have an articulated code because your vision says we want to reduce pavement heat, so every island has a landscaped island, and it has to be a minimum width of 10 feet back curb, with 2 street trees in it. If they want to do 2, and then you may have an understory requirement. But if you want understory, don't leave it to the developer to plant understory out of the kindness of their heart, because they'll just put the 2 street trees there.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, to Randy's point, good planners, good landscape architects can write the code so long as your ultimate goal or your vision can be articulated into words, diagrams, and requirements. And there are some developers who will sit at the table. I had one in probably the last 10 years who sat down and said, I don't care if I have to spend $1 million or $2 million on landscaping. So think about a $2 million landscape. I need my permits, and I need them in the next 6 months. So I know you got a stringent code. I'm not going to fight you about landscaping. Those are guys you want to hug. 1 in 36 years. All the others are just pushing back a little bit.
One of the things that we now find ourselves asking for, particularly with subdivisions, is for them to show the entrance streetscape view, which isn't necessarily really in here. The entrance, the stone walls, the appropriate plantings, and so on. And that's something that would be helpful. And then the other thing that is, in my opinion, completely ineffective is the 3 different delineations that we see repeated over and over, the 50-foot wooded buffer or 20-foot partial landscape screen, not well defined, not necessarily accomplishing the purpose, or the 10-foot landscape screen. So those are things we really need to look at.
And the word adequate
With
is
a
so
6-foot
subjective.
fence.
It has to be an adequate screen, adequate.
But then,
Right, adequate versus
Those three
effective.
Who says
bullets
adequate?
are
What's-
right out of Lane Kendig's book. I could go downstairs on my shelf and show you the book and show you the diagram.
But we can change them.
Yeah.
That's right.
No, and they're right from 1970.
Right,
It's
right.
2025.
Susan, getting back to adequate, I equate adequate with minimum.
Yes.
Yes, I agree with you.
And adequate isn't necessarily enough for our town.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I also think as we think about changes in use, we have to think about what it's going to look like from the future uses.
Or the other frustration is we've designed a plan and it'll look great in about 20 years.
Yeah, okay, I guess.
So one of the other
Maybe.
questions that I usually have
Maybe.
is,
If you do it.
we need to do a buffer between transitioning land uses,
Mm-hmm.
but for whose benefit? Are we, if we allow, pretty soon we'll be seeing a housing project in an industrial zone.
Right.
Are we demanding a buffer to prevent the folks that are moving into that housing project from looking at the gritty parking lots next door? Like to whose
Yes.
benefit is the buffer going in? Is it, I understand if you want to build industrial next to my house, you're gonna buffer me from that. But what about the housing project or the improved use that's going in a less than desirable area? Like, to whose benefit is the buffer? And does that change the parameters of a buffer? You know what I'm saying?
You wanna try and
Yes,
answer that
but
one,
it
Randy?
needs to be the benefit from all uses that are being buffered. You can have a wonderful industrial park
Right.
that's beautifully landscaped that might want buffering from the new residential complex that's going in. I mean,
But
you
does the
really,
back of the grocery store care about the buffering to the housing project going in next door? You know what I mean?
yeah, but it's not just the grocery store, it's the community.
Well, right, but there's a lot of different,
Well, the intent of buffers were, generally speaking, when you are going to have a non-conforming use or you've got use areas next to each other, that when you have a development that's going to change the character of that particular spot,
Yeah.
you're buffering that from the neighbors. And it works both ways. It can work both ways. But, it's kind of because we associate sort of the like you said, gritty parking lot, if you start thinking about how the regulations work in a long-term way, that gritty parking lot isn't always going to be a gritty parking lot.
right.
And so how do you look at buffers? Is it a very short-term view or does it need to be a more long-term view?
Also, a lot of what you're seeing going on now, it seems to me, is a lot of thinking about mixed-use development and how to get more development opportunities out of the areas that we have. And the answer that seems to be coming up a lot is mixed use. If it's going to be mixed use, then whether you think of it as buffer or not, you want to create an environment that's appealing to differing uses. I mean, I don't even think of it as buffers anymore. I think of it as what is the environment you want to create for the particular space.
Yeah, and that's what I kind of said. You have to articulate the vision, because if you take it on a lot by lot cases, you end up with a castle and a moat, and next door to it is a castle and a moat, and next to that is a castle and a moat. When in reality, in totality, you only needed one moat around the 3 castles, not 3 individual moats, and you potentially could have connected the three castles or integrated them. And that's the articulation of a vision that you write in a code. But to Randy's point, if you have single-family housing next to single-family housing, in most instances, even if the single-family housing next to it gets a little bit denser, you're not building a moat and a castle wall, because the uses may be different in density, but it's still residential to residential.
Yeah.
The big harder buffers come in when you have, so Susan, you're gonna have an application where you have an industrial area
Yeah,
that's gonna bring residential in it.
yeah.
That developer is gonna be incentivized to make their residential look extremely attractive and appealing to their residents
For sales.
for sales and marketing. But that's one master, that's the future inhabitant of that area. The second is the existing buffer, existing residential neighborhood and the potential impacts on them. Now, you're not gonna be able to eliminate, but can you soften? And then you also, I've had developers say, I don't wanna landscape the front, cause look at the bus storage parking ugly industrial building across from me. I said, no. Just like you, that may not be that someday. So if street trees were required along your frontage, you're not building those street trees for today's use. You're building it to build the streetscape for what may happen 5, 6, 10, or 30 years down the road. We've always all driven down the roads with beautiful street trees. Someone made those decisions 50, 60, 70 years ago. You're trying to create some of that vision today based on what you've seen and liked in the past.
But the conversation that we're having today with the fellow who wants to put a housing project in the middle of industrial area,
Yeah.
he's incentivized to make it really nice for his residents, I hope.
Yeah.
Conversely, the guy who wants to build an industrial space in the middle of that residential area won't have that same incentive.
But then you have the
So-
separation of uses.
But so does our approach or our conversation need to be different depending on,
Which side?
yeah,
Yeah,
depending on who the audience here is? Because I hope the guy building the housing project is already incentivized to make it really nice and put in a great buffer.
I've worked in communities where the standard for landscaping and industrial building is the same, in some instances more.
but
High-end
But your
residential
question went to the use, and if you think about how regulations are structured, if you're writing the regulations for industrial uses, you'll be looking at it from the standpoint of the developer of the industrial area or the owner of the industrial area. And if you're looking at it from the standpoint of the residential, that creates its different environment. So the answer to your question is yes, you'll have different dictates. That regulatory work takes those differing views into mind. So that's actually pretty easy. To me, the harder part is when you're dealing with a mixed use.
Let's go back to what Maria said a while ago, and landscaping is more than aesthetics.
Yes.
There are other reasons for the landscape.
Yes.
So when we're talking about the buffers between different uses, it's not just aesthetics. It's the big parking lot on the industrial side
Right.
also.
And it's the conditions of the land, et cetera.
Exactly.
And stormwater and all
Yeah.
that stuff.
Yeah.
Also, when we have projects that are supposed to be primarily increasing low moderate housing, often that density can be tripled or quadrupled. How do we then have some kind of ability to, I don't think the word soften is necessarily the right word, but you know what I mean, to try to better manage the impact and create that bit of green space that's so important. And sometimes you'll have an not always very significant an internal green space, and having the ability to make that more positive for the future residents is also a goal.
But do we have a right to ask for that with one of those projects? You know, the clear cut, stone walls come down.
You know what?
Well,
If
there-
you don't ask, It's never gonna
Right.
happen.
There are
If
lots.
it's not
But are
in
we
the
allowed-
regs,
but are
it's
we
not
allowed
there.
to?
Well, but there's a lot of mandates, but think about putting in certain recreational facilities that, and how you can put requirements around that, because you can sell that as a positive for the inhabitants of that community. You've got to figure out how you're going to, other forces are trying to dictate density.
Yeah.
And so you want to figure out how you make it difficult for them to reject the improvements you're talking about. If you're talking about playgrounds and things that are useful for the inhabitants of the building you're putting up, it's going to be harder for harder for legislators to reject that.
But we have a hard time asking a developer to give up a house lot to add amenities for their residents. So if you've got a comprehensive plan that's got
Permit.
a comp permit that's got just triple density going in, they're on a tighter budget now because there's mandatory affordable housing, and now we're asking for a playground or a green space or a picnic area. We've tried that and been shot down. hard.
It's a tighter space. It's, yeah.
I was thinking,
more
I was
constrained,
thinking that you basically make your case not through things that you're asking with respect to the project development, but with respect to what you're putting into your regulations.
But for comp permits, are we allowed to even mandate green space, recreation space?
I would,
So,
I would guess
again,
no, but I don't know.
Like, I don't really know.
So take comp permits just to the side.
Yeah.
Articulate a vision that you want for a stacked flat
Yep.
multifamily housing. That regulation still applies to a comp permit. They can ask for relief on the financial side. They can't afford to build this
Yep.
if they landscape it to that standard.
Yeah.
So they're gonna, but you can't have two separate codes.
Right.
So you're gonna, and in most instances, the developer already through the comp permit is getting added value, either through density or building it where it isn't permitted presently. So in my experience here and in Connecticut and a couple projects in Massachusetts, most of the developers I've sat on either side of the table haven't necessarily balked at the landscape code unless they have difficulty fitting it in an area because they were cramming density in and parking in. So it's not that they didn't want to do it, they just didn't have
They
the
just can't
space
do
to
it there.
So they wanted to trade.
Yep.
It's like, and they had this kind of look, your code requires us to plant 100 street trees.
Yep.
We can only in our layout fit 50, according to your code. We'll plant the other 50. We just want flexibility instead of lining them up like soldiers every 30 feet on center in the parking lot. We're not seeking relief from the 100. We just want relief from lining them up every 30 feet as we go down the street. We'll reforest an area, we'll do something. So again, I would develop a code according to the uses and the separation of uses. The aspect of a comp permit is just a completely different beast and you really can't plan for it.
Yeah, but I
You can
really,
only
what
react to it.
I like about that is you're shifting the burden of proof. So the presumption is that what the town is interested in wins. The developers come up with a different proposal, and then you give concessions. And so you're articulating the guidelines in a different kind of way.
Unless your vision is for canopy coverage over hardscape to mitigate,
Yes.
and so, but your example can still apply if they can meet a coverage, but they still need to plant another 20 trees.
Yeah.
And you can be creative about how that happens.
And we talk a lot about climate change, climate smart design, and it's not just about LEED buildings. It's about stormwater, heat island effect, and so on. So having that kind of a perspective as far as canopy coverage would be a really good one.
And a lot of it, you develop your code, and we'll go back to the landscape islands at the end of parking roads.
Mm-hmm.
When a developer comes in and discusses that, even on a comp permit, it is a clearly articulated vision that is something, you're gonna die on that hill for. Staff can articulate that to the developer and say, look, you can do a whole bunch of other things, but the commission's gonna die on that hill. You need landscape islands at the end of your parking rows, or at a minimum, maybe it's every other one, but don't come in and try and pave 2 acres without a single tree in it. That is just a non-starter. I haven't had tons of pushback on that, because again, they want a path to a permit. They don't all want to fight.
Yeah.
Which is why we need to articulate it better and upfront so that it becomes part of their plan as a whole and not
What
the
they don't
afterthought.
want to know is that the code says street trees 50 feet on center, and for the last 5 years, your unwritten rule is 30 feet on center. So they pay someone like Randy to draw the whole plan completely compliant per your code.
Right.
And then they ask for a waiver, and you go, yeah, well, we'll give you that waiver, but you can do street trees 30 feet on center. Now Randy's got to redraw the whole plan.
But I get paid to do that, so it's okay.
Yeah, no, but that's great, that's great
But
for
it-
you, but that
but it-
pisses them off.
But if that's your goal, then put it in the code that they're 30 feet on center. I mean, I've even learned through the year, I get upset, the one development that we had, that I worked on, where the developer said landscaping, I'll throw money at that. I just need permits, need them quick, because I got Home Depot, he had Kohl's, and he had Target just chomping at the bit, who literally wanted to be in the ground next month. He did that. We actually wrote into that regulation that the street trees had to be planted, and any canopy tree had to be and could not be manipulated in its natural form. Because Randy can attest to this. There are some developers right now who are going in and taking oak trees that are supposed to mature at 70 feet and making them topiaries.
It's happened right on Tower Hill Road to all of the Zelkovas that have been planted, not all, but a good chunk of them have been topped.
Yeah.
And have been that way for decades.
Yeah. There's one development in Killenly, Connecticut called Killenly Commons, where every mature deciduous tree has been lopped at 20 feet. So they're gonna look really silly 20 years from now when they got, 3-foot trunks and they're 20 feet high.
South County Commons, where the buffer was such an integral part of that special management district, and
Well, they let
someone
them
went
out.
in and limbed up
Yeah.
those conifers.
He has supplemented the understory. It's gotta grow, but if you go on the inside of that, you will see substantial understory that's been planted.
So prevention of that kind of thing is also something that would be very helpful. Some kind of clarity and
But if you can't enforce what is needed to sign off on a project and, release the bond, you're never going to enforce that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, you're sending a message to a developer, and his maintenance crew that if, you go and count all the trees and you let 10% die, you didn't let them, but they died, but there's no ramifications, and you return the bond.
Right.
So we
So
had,
the
we
bond
had
is-
a commercial business come to us and ask to add another drive-through. And we said, well, sure, we'll talk about that, but who chopped all the trees down? Like, all the street trees were gone. And they were like, oh, we don't know anything about that. We gave them a permit for their new drive-through, and the trees never came back.
But you could have tied a stipulation that,
They've been issued a notice of violation and they're in the municipal court process.
But they've had their drive-through for 2 years. We should have never given them the drive-through.
Enforcement you can't.
Oh my, that's,
You can't take an existing enforcement action and withhold a permit.
one of the things, though, that we have discussed.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
Has that ever been brought to court to challenge and try to overturn that hypothesis?
I want to say yes and no, and I'm going to be at.
I mean, I know.
No, I'm going to be at a land use seminar this coming Saturday for like 8 hours. But the issue, Randy, is the legislative authority, not the regulatory authority of a board or commission, is to approve or deny based on compliance with your existing regulations. a non-compliance with an approval, prior approval, is an enforcement action given to the regulatory authority of a zoning enforcement officer or a code compliant officer, not necessarily a planning board. So it's a separate, distinct.
So if you were the applicant, you could argue you're being punished for inaction of the community because they didn't enforce it. So something new is
Right.
that shouldn't be it should be your issue, but it's not my issue.
Not my issue.
They
If
didn't.
you have an enforcement issue with me, take me to court on that enforcement action. You can't preclude me from applying for and receiving a permit that may fix that or change it completely. It's not a,
unjust. They didn't let the trees die. They were beautiful. They were beautiful, and they just chopped them down. They weren't neglected and died. They deliberately went out and chopped down beautiful trees
except for a couple of Japanese red maples, which were hand dug and
and stolen. Yeah, they walked off the site.
a landscaper was told to clear it. He didn't cut those.
No, he didn't cut those. He
And-
left the miscanthus grass there. The stuff's this big now.
Yeah. We had also been told that having a municipal court will somehow strengthen our enforcement ability.
So Burger King is in the process of potentially complying. Where a street tree was supposed to be, their landscaper decided to put a limelight hydrangea. Because that's just like a decidual red maple.
But some of the trees there's just nothing there except a stump that sits 8 inches off the ground. Like just taunting us when you drive by. Because this stump is like that high and it's just, okay, I've gone down a little rabbit hole here, sorry.
Okay, so Randy, you've heard a bunch of
It's
our,
never gonna be not frustrating.
but it can be
Sorry.
better.
They never told me that.
They
You
could
never
be
told me
better.
that.
Well, now you
You're playing tag.
So where do we even start? Like, how do we even begin to do
The top 5 issues with what you have for regs now, that if you could wave a magic wand, what are those top 5? The things that you just, get frustrated with because they seem to reoccur over and over again.
The lowest hanging fruit is simply updating where we want developers to get quality plant lists from.
You mean
Because-
like you were mentioning earlier, or someone was mentioning earlier about the new list online?
Choices.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this
Yes,
list's a
choices, but-
1995 book. It's a hardcover book that you can get at your library as our plant source. And I think we can do better than that, because that's what's in here.
But then in addition to choosing the right plants, it's having the guidance so that we don't have these, the
Rows of
landscape
arborvitae's.
buffer or the partial land, I mean, that
Well,
should,
that's-
that word should just be
Yeah,
eliminated, partial. So a set of better criteria,
right. With some illustrations that
very important to have
Yeah.
illustrations.
So just going back to Susan's point, I think it's potentially, Randy mentioned Zelkovas before. Zelkova's not gonna be on that native plant list.
So do all
We're
your
not
plants,
limiting- no,
regardless,
no,
regardless of where they're being installed, have to be a native plant?
No.
Right, so
no.
that's the discussion
Absolutely not.
It's not, you wanna stay native in some aspect.
Yes,
And you can do that. You're gonna limit your palette substantially
Well, yeah,
to go completely.
right, and the
I
way
wouldn't,
I
I wouldn't
mean, there's a
mandate
lot-
that.
I would look at it this way. A native plant in a area along Tower Hill Road doesn't make any sense. And it's not because it looks out of place. It's because the soils.
Hi.
I think this would be a better meeting.
Yes, we're talking about
Thank you
landscaping.
for saying that.
We're talking about
We
plants
are.
and flowers.
Improving things, yep.
Plants and flowers.
Are you just making a vote and getting out of here, or do you have to discuss it for the next 2 hours?
The meeting
I'll
could be
watch
real
yours.
simple tonight.
Sure.
Could be.
Come and hang out with us.
I love landscaping.
That's what we're doing.
Flowers.
Trees.
Oh, on video. So
So, yeah, the
so-
native, the issue of design and design creativity, flexibility, obviously can't just be limited to natives.
this specifically says you can't plant invasives. And I don't think we have that anywhere now in our regulations, does it?
And I don't think we even have, is there a Rhode Island invasives list, or is that just the one through URI Cooperative Extension?
So this is
CRMC has one, but I think that's,
RINHS. Who's that?
Natural History Survey.
Invasive and weedy plants in Rhode Island 2020. They're saying to go look
So
at that.
that's a publication
And they said,
from-
this is the Conservation Commission, they said is strictly prohibited. Anything off that list? But I don't know that it actually says.
But you want the reverse, you want what is encouraged.
Right, but it's also nice to have a list
Yeah,
of things
you've
that are
got-
prohibited.
No,
prohibited
but
too.
I think your idea is a great one. I think this is actually low-hanging fruit. You look through the regulations and see where is it that we refer to specific sources, and you think about, are those sources that are identified the ones we want?
Right.
And are these things we want to prohibit, or are these things we want to encourage? And you can use them both, and you can
Yes.
use them in different ways. And so looking through the regs and seeing where those things are, that's kind of an easy first step.
What have you seen in other forward-thinking communities?
well, they all struggle with the same thing because, time goes on, and then what's an invasive 20 years ago?
Yes.
I mean, that
Yeah.
list is ebbing and flowing because of climate change, and you've got new plants that are coming in that
Yep.
are, and so some people are thinking about it from the standpoint of, well, if that's a native plant in New Jersey, but it's not a native plant in Rhode Island, it's going to be a native plant in Rhode Island in probably another 20 years. So,
Because it'll be naturalized.
yeah.
Right. But we also think that due to climate impacts and potential growing zone changes, oh, well, we're zone 7B now, so we can plant all these things. But then you have a winter like this previous one, and it's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, and that's why I think you need to be. There's to me, well, yeah, I think you need to have a broader plant list. I think in a
Yeah.
general sense,
Yeah.
invasives you shouldn't be planting them. They shouldn't be allowed. You probably even might want to consider going so far as having a soil management plan for invasives so that they're not digging up knotweed when they're digging up a foundation and dumping it somewhere else and
Yeah.
making that problem somewhere else. But I think, the idea of plant selection, I would say a broader palette, but when you're talking about reinforcing a buffer, you can give guidelines that the plant palette needs to be of a similar nature to that buffer that you're reinforcing. And if that buffer is filled with invasives, obviously you're not going to do that. But if it's like a sort of a red maple viburnum type of natural buffer, then that's the kind of thing that they should be planting. And if they're going to create a buffer, what's the nature of the environment? What's the soil types? What are the you can't go start planting red maples if it's a really sandy gravel and it's never going to live.
Right.
So that I think there should be language in there about plant selection. I think I would be a person that would say have a broader range. If they're doing a rain garden or some sort of low impact design stormwater feature up against a more naturalistic buffer, then the plant palette obviously needs to be able to survive in both a drought but also in inundation, but it should also match the character of what it's next to.
So that's 2 out of 5 so far, right? Plant list, appropriateness, broader palette, buffers. What else?
Enforcement?
We're not going to be able to do anything about that. Not in this.
Okay.
No. The only thing on the enforcement side
I know.
is to the question of length of warranty
Right.
via financial surety. Is it a 1-year warranty for not,
That's-
we'll say understory stuff and a 2-year on
Warranty.
trees, or just
That's
do a
important.
2-year? I think 2 years too is too tough. We have one where somehow the
Used
project
to
was
always do
approved
2
in
years.
February. And the developer's being extremely reasonable because I've asked them to give me a little more flexibility. I wanna see one more leaf out, because I could give the surety back a month ago, and I could have 10 trees that don't leaf out this spring, and then I have no recourse. I'm in an enforcement action there that your plants that are part of the approval died.
Do we need to improve our parking lot requirements?
That should be considered. And I just put down streetscape too, as we discussed for, I don't know, I'm assuming that's a top 5, but.
Like, do we have parking lots in town that are grandfathered into old regulations? Or are there parking lots in town, say the one at Belmont, is that within regulation?
Well, Belmont is probably was grandfathered, and that's just been repaved. Shaw's is a repaved.
So
Again, you have to
if they built that now, what would?
articulate the view. What do you want it to be?
But you have regulations for parking lots. So let's
But
say,
the-
if one of those was redone and they wanted to follow the regulations here, would it be
They want to just
adequate?
reorganize
No.
the parking
If
lot?
they're gonna, if they were building that brand new today.
Yep.
Right now, the Belmont Plaza
Your
is
code's
just,
still weak.
so how much better would, I can't picture how big a 50,000 square foot parking lot
I'm
is. So
using
how-
the term weak. I don't think it would represent the vision you see in your head for a landscape parking
Exactly,
lot.
Okay.
exactly.
So
Yeah,
how much
there's
better does
no-
this have to get? Because I can't picture,
Right.
I can't picture what it should be because all I know is the way it is.
Part of it, you have to combine
It's
your
really sad.
parking standards and your landscape standards. Because in most towns who are trying to articulate a vision on a larger parking lot, they'll have regulations that you can have no more than 2 bays without a center island. So you can't drive diagonal through a parking field. So you would have a drive aisle flanked by 2 rows of cars, then a row of cars, drive aisle, row of cars. Then you need a fully divided landscape island. The landscape island has a minimum back a curb width. Within that island, there's a street tree requirement of X number on center, with understory or not understory. And if you don't articulate it that way and you just leave it to a square footage requirement, there's gonna be some engineer or designer
Yep.
who reads the code
Yep.
and says, all right, my person said they don't want any obstructions for snow plowing, so they're gonna push all of the square footage to the perimeter, so there isn't a single island
That's a good point.
other than light poles within your parking field. If that's not your vision, to Caper's point earlier, now you're not fighting, you're hoping you can horse trade with them on something else, versus if you wanted to not have cars drive diagonal. We use Wakefield Mall as a you have the end of rows that you don't really realize you're coming to an end of a row and entering a main drive aisle,
Until someone hits you, yes.
right? Unless you're really familiar with it, and then even then, I see
avoid
people
it.
drive I mean, you can go from the bank to McDonald's, driving straight through every parking aisle,
That's right.
and people do it every single day.
And they do it really fast too.
And,
Yeah.
right, or
Yeah.
they'll go diagonal from the bank to Staples. And and worse, if there's 2 large box trucks parked at the end of those aisles, your sight line's gone. So the islands at the end of rows of parking create sight line, create rest views, and create a landscape opportunity. If that's the vision you want, you can clearly articulate that in a code, if that's your vision.
Would you be able to do a little exercise? I assume we're gonna meet again. Would you be able to take a parking lot in town, one that we're all familiar with, whether it's the one at Shaw's or Belmont, overlay what we have for requirements so that we can see how much improvement our regulations need to get to where we're
I would say I'd take a slightly different approach, because we're trying to look forward here, so if we're doing that, we're kind of looking back.
Yep.
When you're out and about over the next month or so, and you're in a parking lot that
does fit.
feels right, and it may not be in its entirety, but it might have features that feel right. Take a picture of it.
Okay.
Well, the other thing I was thinking of is if we're gonna look at rewriting the regs, I'd go with our old Tower Hill Road plan rather than Belmont's. That the density there is intense, and they're all stores that are surviving. So I think the notion that we're going to change the Belmont parking
No,
situation.
sorry,
is-
I wasn't implying that we were gonna change it. But the problem is that right now, it's 100% asphalt. If I look at what our regulations say, would it be okay if they had to follow this? Or is it still bad and we need to totally
I think
cross this
Jamie
off?
already answered that
Right,
question.
that was my question.
Because
Was that
again, they
I
would have
can't-
just pushed all the landscaping to the perimeter.
But I'd
What
focus.
communities have you worked in or seen that you think have some pretty solid regs?
For parking lots, Lisbon, Connecticut, I mean, they, 500,000 square feet of retail with 1,200 street trees in the parking field. So they had regs, street trees and islands, perimeter of the parking lot, ringed with street trees, and then frontage ring with street trees. So if you had a frontage road, you had a row of street trees, and then if you had a parking lot internal to that, you had another row of street trees.
Oh.
And then every island in there has a street tree in it, no more than 2 or 3 islands, you have to divide them, so you can't go diagonal through them.
Right.
When you drive by that development 20 years later, you can't even see the stores anymore.
So I have, but
So
what
a
are
good example for you locally is probably Garden City. If you look, I'm old enough, I know where Child World used to be. So if you look at the southern part of Garden City, that's more wide open parking area.
Yeah.
When you look at the northern part of Garden City, it's more walkable, there's more islands, there's more smaller parking bays. If you like the northern part of Garden City better than the southern part, you can easily code out the southern part.
So I have a question about that. Though it strikes me that our shopping areas are different than Garden City because we're an odd community. You know, we're like a shopping section for neighboring communities who don't have a lot of different commercial establishments. We're a shopping center for second home owners. We're a shopping center for students, but we're not a shopping center. We don't have a lot of retail. We don't have a lot of clothing stores. We've got Marshalls. I mean, we're
We're not a destination.
What I'm
we're
saying-
not.
no,
No, but
what
we're what we are is we're a stop
So
off
I-
and get supplies.
I can show you a Home Depot in Montville, Connecticut with literally no street trees in the entire parking lot. And then I can show you a Home Depot built in another town with a fairly stringent landscape code that has 300 trees in the parking lot. As a community, one community decided that economic development was more important than requiring a developer to plant street trees. And another community said, if you want to develop in this town, this is the aesthetics we're trying to achieve.
That's
And you
fair.
enhance.
That's fair.
And we're willing
That's
to maybe say no to 7 out of 10 developers, but we'll still get the 7 where the other town didn't want to say no to anyone. So the minute a developer said, if you require me to landscape, I'm going one town over, they said, no, come back,
Well,
come
we-
back. We won't require you to do any street trees.
Which is
We-
not going to
we
really
also
be a
have to-
huge issue in this community because it is sort of a, when developers are looking at hot spots on the map, I mean, South County is going to generally show up as a hot spot, and then South Kingstown, Narragansett area is going to show up as a desirable place to be here.
Yes, but we don't have the balls to stand up to URI.
So what is URI doing that's degrading our landscape?
They are not planning adequate housing, and we're enabling it.
But how does that impact the landscape regs?
We're not.
It
Again, we're talking
impacts
about
the
landscape.
development. It's not necessarily. It's impacting
Volume of
volume of parking, and the other thing
But
is
how does URI
neigh-
make an impact on that?
they don't build housing. They all of their housing plans, and I may be overstating this, but it strikes me that what I've read is all the housing plans I see are trying to upgrade their existing housing to make it habitable. And they're not talking about implementing any more housing. What they're talking about doing is increasing classrooms and increasing specialty areas so that they're building to increase their enrollment and not increase their housing. Narragansett is taking action to decrease the potential housing, and clearly they're looking for us to supply the difference. In addition, on the commercial front, we're a destination shopping area for a number of different towns who don't have commercial centers. So we have, 3 different grocery stores? So we've got a huge demand for parking, which goes up and down. And I
It's pretty
don't,
easy to figure out what your demand and use is.
Yeah.
well,
You look at an aerial map,
yeah,
and on a Sunday morning, and count the number of oil spots in it, and that will tell you whether or not that parking lot at its peak, generally speaking, has extra parking spaces in it. I mean, you could be able to see, you know, that parking lot is 50% used, and you'll see the distribution of where it's mostly where cars are parked. But I'm not exactly sure about how that approach of URI has made the parking lots in South Kingstown kind of blight looking.
And to go back to Garden City for a minute, I feel much safer as a pedestrian in Garden City than I do in most
yes,
of our...
well, it's a completely different, it's a completely
Yes, on the
different
north
And on the
design.
And they
southern
have
side,
the-
though, you have well-defined drive aisles.
You know, they have the elevated crosswalks, they have more than just kind of the end areas to the...
But they have more definition of parking bays than you would see
Yes.
just about
Yes.
anywhere.
Yes.
Because every bay is almost, you know, a
It's
row
a-
of car, 2 rows of cars in a drive aisle.
Plus, yeah,
And they
Yeah,
have walkways too.
walkways.
yeah.
So in here, it does say, in these regulations, it has, you know, for a 9-foot wide times 18-foot half-end islands, 1 tree, 1 low shrub. This has 2 end islands. Like, that seems to be in here for new
That's at
parking.
the end of the rows, though. What happens in between?
Well, right now, we don't have any, but we don't have any lots, I think that,
'Cause you
Comply.
haven't had any big developments come in. that way.
but at some point,
And it's
this
not gonna
was
change.
aspirational, right? When this was written, this was,
It was changing from, someone decided that what was already built, they didn't necessarily appreciate that. There are books that get written, people go to conferences, they see the latest thing, and when those regs were rewritten, the latest thing was a book called Performance Zoning, written by Lane Kendig. It's a brown-bound book that has the square footage ratios and had some new parking standards for landscaping. And you're not the only community. Communities in the entire country adopted that square footage code. For every parking space, you get 50 square feet. Your buffers of like 20, 10, and 5 with a fence are hybrids of that exact code. So that was your attempt in the 1970s and 80s to improve again, and I think what you're learning that you can even potentially do something slightly different, not that different than that, to articulate and drive the product you envisioned versus leaving it completely up and fighting with the developer that, yes, I have 100 parking spaces, therefore I'm required to have 50,000 or 5,000, 5,000 square feet of landscaping, and I did my end caps, but then I'm putting the other stuff where I want to.
Right.
That doesn't affect what I see as my functionality. If you took a developer and said, what do you prefer to plow? The southern end of Garden City or the northern end? Everyone's gonna say the southern end. It's a pain in the butt. I gotta plow it, I gotta have bobcats, I gotta have a payloader, I gotta move snow,
I
I
was
have
just
no
gonna
place
say,
to
I
stack
bet you
it.
if you go out there, you're gonna see a payloader in the south and you're gonna see a Bobcat in the north.
Yeah.
Just parked waiting for the snowstorm to happen.
Yeah. And that's always my first discussion when people, the developer says, oh my God, this is gonna cost me, 25, 30% more to remove snow. But communities who have a vision are okay with that because that's the vision they're trying to articulate. And it may take them a little, yes, they can't start at the south end of Garden City or north end and plow all the way down to Whole Foods. Just, that's their perfect world. And then pilot in mountains wherever they want. I mean, there's one in Wyoming in front of Ocean State Job Lot, I think still has 25-foot tall snow piles in the middle of a parking lot that the only vertical element other than the snow piles are the light poles on 5-foot concrete bases, but not a single tree.
It's like what we used to say about street design. If we allowed all of our internal street design within subdivisions to be designed for fire trucks, then we'd have these enormous,
It's amazing how fire trucks can get through a dense urban area too.
and they do go in reverse, which,
Shocking, isn't it?
and then we just have to be careful about some of the language. Some of the language in one of the parking lot sections talks about low shrubs or turf may be substituted for trees within the interior. We just have to be careful what the criteria is for that.
Or not allow that at all.
Yep. Right.
I mean, if you want parking lots with trees, street trees in there, and you're trying to create an aesthetic that is something other than,
Any place USA?
or what we currently have out there now, I think you'd get away from that kind of language.
Yep.
I mean, to Jamie's point, and he's like, and that's why when you were talking about, can we graphically create what this looks like?
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it's like, well, what do you want your parking lots to look like? What do you want your development to look like from a landscape standpoint? What's important? And then put together a vision for what that should be, and then write the regs to
And
be
just-
able to support that vision.
And just disregard.
A lot of stuff.
So there's the 4 most popular spots in the Belmont parking lot are the 4 that are in the shade of that big old maple over by the exit over by. Have
Interesting.
you noticed that? The
No,
exit by
I
Holland
avoid
Street.
that parking lot,
Across
so
the
I-
street, there's a big old maple tree
Uh-huh.
which casts shade onto 4 sweet parking spots in the summertime from the neighbor's maple tree. Because it would be, how nice would it be to be able to park in the shade in the Belmont parking lot?
Interesting.
All right, so we have some instructions to go take some photographs around
So
good landscaping.
here's a good example. If you can see that. That's an entry drive. Does anyone want to know what it's an entry drive to?
Taft Hill.
No, to Lowe's and a Target.
Wow.
Wow.
The developer did not plant those street trees 35 feet on center out of the kindness of his heart. He planted them because they were required by a code.
And then also look at the area in which the trees are planted. It's not a 3-foot wide strip.
Yeah.
It's an area suitable for being able to support those trees as
Yeah.
they get bigger.
Really important. Yep.
So what is that photograph? Is that a residential neighborhood or is that the edge of a parking lot?
That is the entry drive to this development.
Wow. I couldn't even see what was behind those trees.
And then if you look across the street, which again doesn't look like
Oh my
it's,
God.
there's 1,200 street
We're not
trees
aspiring to that,
here.
right?
But if you go,
Well, we're not getting it.
Good.
Where is that, Jamie?
Gee.
this is in Lisbon, Connecticut. But when we drop down the street view,
So there's quite a grade change between those two places that you were just looking at too.
yes. I'll try and go a little bit further down. Sorry. You can't see Home Depot
Right.
from the street.
What
Now-
about in February? So
Well,
that's another
again,
thing.
there is, but, so this is commercial to commercial. There's an area of this that's residential to the southern part of this site. And to your point, what do you want the development that's commercial to look like? There's a substantial evergreen buffer between the back of some buildings and a residential community on the southern side of this site that is basically impenetrable. That was required by our regulations. And there's significant grade elevations here, but this is about a 30-acre site and 1,200 street trees were planted.
So seasonality is a topic that comes up all the time. If we see a bunch of deciduous plantings, and then, come, half of the year, you see it doesn't look like anything, and then you see grasses that are mohawked off that are, certainly don't contribute to the landscape. And not that every design needs to have that element, but certainly in a lot of the commercial type projects, you want to see mixed conifers with deciduous, and to get people to be thinking that way.
The straight,
Is
evenly spaced
challenging.
row of green giant arborvitae is my favorite.
It's a staggered row. Once they get really big, it looks like a straight row.
But it's when they get really big,
Yeah,
then I don't mind them.
yeah, exactly.
They look really stupid when they're not really big.
No, anything, well, except for street trees, anything planted in a dead straight row kind of doesn't look very,
We see that all too often,
Naturalistic.
actually. Right, so there's a way to articulate that, yes?
And then there are some instances where I was just in Newburyport in a downtown setting where they made some, I would say, educated decisions on their streetscape, where their buildings are the streetscape that don't need a tree out in front of them, because they're celebrating the architecture of the building. And in some
Oh.
instances, if your architecture is nice, you're not hiding it. You may be softening it, but you're not,
Yeah.
You're not
Yeah.
dependent on the
you're
Yeah.
not
Right.
dependent on it.
then you just have pocket parks
And-
every
and that's
block
what
or so.
Newburyport
Boy,
did,
I'd
and
love
there
to
are,
see
you know,
that.
there are little places in Newton and Natick and everything that, you come into these little villages and it's kind of street treed, and then when the village comes, street trees go away. And maybe there's a really ornate lamp post, but you don't need to carry that theme because you're actually celebrating the architecture. And I think there's some components as you go through the mixed use where with really good architecture,
I like that.
the landscape softens it, but it doesn't need to hide it, especially when you're mixed use to mixed use across the street. And that was something we tried to do in this Lisbon scenario where we knew we had 500,000 square feet going on one side of the road and potentially 300,000 or 400,000 going across the street. So we didn't need to, it wasn't a castle, a moat, and a wall. It was a moat and a wall around both projects. And then something really nice in between all of them. And then we had sidewalks connecting both.
Well, if you ever do, not that I'm advocating this, but if you do any kind of visual preference surveys, most people are going to want that leafy canopy that's inviting, that's cooling, that.
So my daughter lives down in Washington DC, and it's very, very densely developed with apartment buildings. It is the street. It is a 8-10 foot wide basic rain garden, depressed gardens, and then a bench, and then the sidewalk, and then the storefronts. So almost the entirety of all of the sidewalks, you're under a canopy of trees with a building on one side and a canopy of trees and gardens and benches, and then the roadway. And the whole of Noma has been developed that way. So like in front of every single building, there is 5, 8, 10 foot wide, mostly depressed because that's where all the rainwater seems to end up, all gardens and street trees. Just on every sidewalk, it's like this now. So there's very few
That's nice to
sidewalks that
hear.
aren't canopied with
Yep.
trees and full of like some kind of vegetation in those gardens and then benches.
Rain gardens
Makes
can
it very
certainly act,
walkable.
as a dual purpose
Mm-hmm.
kind of, but they need to be designed and maintained properly too.
Well, a lot of them are full of trash, but they are canopy though. They at
You
least
just
are-
ruined it for us.
Well, that's right.
You didn't tell us
Created
the
such a
whole
nice-
story.
I know.
A nice
It is
image.
really beautiful. No, there's no trash. There's no rats either. But there is a nice canopy.
No, there are some great things that they've done in the Boston metro area
Hmm.
with sunken rain garden, street trees, grasses, other understory plantings that are
Seating
there
areas.
year-round.
Mm-hmm.
But again, you had an example locally. Go to South County Commons. Look at the landscaping associated with the main village component and the main aisle. Then go down by the cinema and just look at a sea of parking. There, that meets your zoning code.
But most of that is just a bucket with something planted in it. There's nothing in, like that whole main shopping area, the only green is like
That's what
big
I'm saying.
planter buckets.
And where the cinema is, between the cinema and the hotel, is just one big parking field.
Right. Right.
But that was regulatory compliant.
And that was a special management district, which should have more than the norm.
So the question is if you did that over again, you probably still want the perimeter buffer, but would you just pave a 5-acre parking lot?
Well, was that, is, for example, in that project, was it a choice where the planning determined they wanted the buffers more than they wanted the parking lot? Was there a trade-off there where what would have been interior was deliberately pushed to the outside because the buffer was more valuable than the parking lot design? You know what I'm saying?
But why can't you have both?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yep.
But,
That's the question,
right.
right? And again, I started the conversation that you can be at the cutting edge of something new and some articulating a vision, but your role isn't to make it so stringent that it's unachievable,
Right.
right?
Yeah. So what else do you need from us?
That's all good
Imagine-
information.
He needs a magic wand.
Oh my God, I don't know where to start.
Mm. Now I need some time. And some photos.
Okay.
And the Tower Hill Road landscape regs too.
I'll get you that.
Okay.
Are you the clearinghouse, Jamie, for good photographs of things we
I mean,
find?
those are kind of generic, what they provided us.
Yeah, if you can
For Old
send them
Town
to
Hill
me,
Road?
do you wanna set a date in like the
Yeah.
next
Yeah, let's do that.
10 days or?
To get the photographs?
Yeah,
Yep.
what you,
Well, what do you want pictures of? Just parking lots? or
Well,
what?
Of course, this time of
other
year, they're gonna look,
Yeah, but that's okay because I think that's very instructive too. Because if
Okay.
it looks good at this time of year, then
that's a very good point, actually. If it looks good this time of year. We may be going beyond,
Well, that requires a lot more imagination than I have.
you just whatever you happen to be inspired by, just take a picture of it.
Okay.
Don't worry about whether I'm gonna think it looks good or not. Your inspiration is what your inspiration is more important.
You don't want pictures of stuff we hate too, right?
You could throw a little bit of that in, but I'd focus more on
what was
the
that?
Stuff we don't like.
Oh, yeah, no, I think he probably has a pretty good sense of that.
yeah.
That's
wanna-
easier to imagine.
And we're not limiting this to parking lots, correct?
Right. No, any sort of like screening, buffering.
Okay.
They're trying to hide the trash
Yep.
areas.
Yep.
Is this landscape conversation going to also include stone walls, or is that a separate topic?
Oh, yeah, that's, stone walls are
Like I know
part
that
of the,
the
overall-
Historic District Commission is thinking about stone walls also.
I think
Well, we're not foreclosed.
some of the difficulty is a stone wall can run $200 a linear foot, where a street tree planted 40 feet on center is $500 or $1,000 every 100 feet versus $20,000 every.
I
100
don't know
feet.
that I would hope that everyone rebuilds all their stone walls, but I think that when you're starting to lay out a design, there's a way to do it where you're respectful of the stone walls that are historic to the landscape, and
that's in
other
our
ones where
regs,
they're not.
Isn't it?
Yeah,
We've had projects come
There's-
where they've tried to work with the existing stone walls or the existing large caliper trees. And we've had other projects where they just clear cut everything. And is there some way to maintain some stone walls and those historic big old trees that we don't have the power to save if the developer says, sorry, can't do it, and we lose all the trees? They're just down Holly Street, did you see that?
I saw.
Oh,
I have a developer in another community right now who is logging the property and taking the stone walls off the property before he subdivides the property, where in the subdivision regulations, it says you shall maintain and utilize existing stone walls as property lines.
It's called double dipping, isn't it?
Yeah.
Enforcement action.
Yeah, but the problem
We
is
have
the,
2 against him right now. In this community, because of the removal of stone walls, we rewrote the excavation regulations to include above and below ground.
Newport.
Above and below ground, you said?
The movement of over, I think it's like 100 cubic yards of material. So it's like 5 triaxle loads.
Right.
Above or below. Triggers a special permit for an excavation.
the reality is, if you bring your enforcement action after it's already taken down, you'll only get money damages, you won't get it redone.
Right.
You have to
Right,
bring it
right.
in advance.
And it doesn't mean someone can't remove the stone walls, there's just a process. Like you can't take your front end loader and drive it through the stream channel.
There was some kind of, something
April
passed
4th.
at the state level for,
Or
It's like,
2 weeks.
it's a little over 2 weeks.
What day of the week is that?
It's a Friday.
Okay.
It gives you 2 weekends between now and then.
yeah.
What's April 4th?
The deadline for taking
Photograph.
our photographs.
Okay.
And if you send them to me, great. If you have them on a camera, we can take the disc out and put it on a laptop.
Hey, Jamie, what's this thing that somebody's given us?
So Rich did some work 4 or 5 years ago, just trying to articulate that there isn't one size fits all. When you're like south of Route 1, you're not gonna be asking a developer to plant big old sugar maples. There you may be, your landscape vernacular may be split rail fences and stone walls versus lining things with street trees. It may be a different type of tree. There may be more understory work. There are different requirements, on Tower Hill than there may be on a development on Main Street or 108 or by your,
So when shall we meet again?
I kind of like this Monday night thing. Oh.
Well, if it's on Monday before not a Tuesday.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, if it's an off week,
Right.
I can deal with that.
But
Do you wanna
Monday
look
then
at the
Tuesday.
calendar for an
Yes.
off week in April?
Sure.
Maybe a week or 2 after the. photos
Like
come in.
2 weeks after would be great.
Yeah, okay.
So plus or minus the
Sure.
17th. Or that week there.
And tell my puppy not to get sick.
Yeah, at 3 in the morning?
Great, I didn't
I know
even
I'm
have to
awake,
poke you.
I'm awake, I'm awake.
How long before you got back to sleep last night?
Oh no, I was up most of the night. 12:30, 3:30, 4:30, and she would only sleep on top of me, so it was not hard.
But what's
It was-
12:30? The sweet part of when you're just getting off to sleep? Like that's when
I go to sleep at 11,
Oh,
so
You were just
22nd
getting
of
into your
April.
See, mine's
So
got
the
2.
28th maybe?
That's a Monday?
Yeah.
Look up Belmont, Massachusetts High School.
How does that look for you?
I meant to send you the photos, but I
Oh.
didn't.
Oops.
In some ways, it was similar to what we
What was that
saw,
again? I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
April 28th,
But it's brick.
Monday?
Yeah.
I will not be around.
And they're good. They're
Okay.
good shots of it, too.
Oh,
So
good.
So, one,
I'm
two.
curious to know what you think.
I
You
ran
won't-
into
You won't like it.
I ran into the music director today at Belmont. We had a nice chat, and he's
Is
very
the-
excited about Fritz Benz, who's the music director at the high school orchestra. They're very excited about it's a.
We can't do the 21st
750
because we have a meeting the next
auditorium.
night.
How
And they
about
are
the
very excited
30th?
about this.
That's the
This thing. It's
fifth
really good.
Wednesday of
Do you know
month.
the music?
Mondays are better, I think. for
I
most
have some
people.
musical instruments that I'm probably gonna
Hold on.
donate.
Oh.
I played all,
May
I
5th?
played woodwinds and I haven't.
Yeah, I'm going to be
rolled
in
a
San Francisco the last
Wow.
week of.
Okay.
I still
April.
play my.
So how about May
saxophone
5th?
But I'm never
Oh,
gonna
good for
play,
you.
never gonna play the oboe
Yep.
again.
Okay. May 5th,
I'd rather-
everybody?
I can get him in
May
touch with
5th?
you.
Well, give me his, I have to check, I have to get my oboe out and see if it's still working, all right, because I would,
So,
Do you just want to?
That's a Monday,
Are we adjourned?
Yeah. Okay.
May 5th at 6?
because I would get the instruments serviced.
May 5th?
At
Yes.
6.
Uh-oh.
At 6.
So just for
o'clock.
clarity,
And
Maria,
photos
you're adjourning
with
at
photos.
7:38.
Yes, we are.
Sorry, what was the photos due date?
April 4th.
Fourth.
To Jamie.